we're studying and today, there's a really long and consistent kind of, pattern of American intervention throughout Latin America. If we count indirect interventions where we have business interests disrupting governments, or we look at formal interventions where organizations like the CIA or the American military in places like Cuba are going to intervene, there's like 46 to 50 different interventions that take place from the 1890s till today. Very consistent, the United States is going to be involved in Latin America. Part of this is the Monroe Doctrine. One of the things that very early in the United States, this would be a continuity for us to think about, is during the Monroe administration, he's one of our first presidents, one of the things that they're going to try to do is tell European countries that they need to stay out of anything that's happening in the Western Hemisphere. So in North, South America, or the Caribbean, the United States will provide for the stability of those regions. Where on the flip side, they're saying, you can stay over there, you stay out of our business. We're going to see how that kind of changes over time, but that's one of the continuities we're going to see. We're going to see that added onto by the Roosevelt Doctrine, but we're not quite there yet. So, during this time period, the United States is intervening again and again in Latin America, and throughout his time in office, Theodore Roosevelt, who's going to be one of our big historical agents today, Teddy Roosevelt is going to be a person that's going to be the Secretary of the Navy during the Spanish-American War. He eventually rises to the presidency, and as this happens, during his time in office, U.S. control over Cuba, even after its formal independence in 1902, as well as Puerto Rico, he's going to deploy the naval forces to ensure Panama's independence from Colombia in 1901, and in 1904 he's going to proclaim U.S. police power in the Caribbean. This idea, okay, so one of the things we got to talk about, this is going to be important to us, especially when we get to the 1950s and the Korean War. Anybody a CJ person, criminal justice? That's rare. Waldorf used to just be all criminal justice people. Everybody wanted to be cops. Good for you guys. I got nothing against the police, I guess. Somebody breaks into your house. You call the police. What's the police's responsibility? That's what the dispatcher will say. We're on our way. And they get there, what do you expect them to do? What?
So they normally show up late as fuck.
Oh, that could be. I don't know. I've never called the police for a break-in. The one time I got robbed, I knew who did it. We went and kicked in his door and broke all his shit.
That's how you gotta do it.
At that point in my life, we weren't calling the police.
You broke the police.
Now I might. Somebody breaks into my house, Bailey. If I'm not there, if I'm there, they're probably dead, right? We'll use the gun behind the refrigerator and just blast them full of holes. We have a good home defense policy.
Arthur the dog attacks.
Arthur the dog would let us know what's up. He's a very good watchdog, although at 30 pounds, not much of an obstacle for people. But he's very quiet unless it's something's off. Like, for instance, my dad came over to watch football last Saturday, and my dad decided to walk from his house, which is like 8 blocks from our house, instead of driving. And Arthur knows my dad's car. So like if he shows up, Kendall, welcome. Telling a story about the dog being a good guard dog makes no sense. Bailey's like waiting to take notes. She's like, what? I'm here. I know. But because my dad walked up instead of driving his truck, he like went berserk. Because he's like, this is somebody that shouldn't be walking across our yard. So usually that gives us enough time, you know. They don't know what's up. We keep a lot of guns around the house. That's why we can't have kids, Nico. Play with all the guns. Then we wouldn't have kids anymore. Just kidding. We'd have to practice better gun safety.
Yeah.
Anyway, if you're a person that calls the police, you probably are calling them to hope that they're going to come and put things back in order, whatever that may be. Whether that's arresting the people and having them provide some type of restitution, be that financially or be it in terms of actual like a jail sentence, whatever that might be, or maybe they're just gonna like go find and bring your stuff back. But after a police action, we hope that things are back to what they were before the situation happened. That's what I was hoping the answer would be. Does that make sense? Ideally, that's what the police are supposed to do. That none of us know what the police are supposed to do maybe worries me. But this idea that as we kind of start to take on this role of the United States as being this police party in particularly the Caribbean and Latin America, this is important for us in this class because this is going to establish a pattern that's going to become global after World War II as the United States military gets more powerful and the United States rises to becoming one of the most powerful nations in the world, if not the most powerful nation in the world. This is going to be something that we're going to need to understand to look at the Korean War, as well as looking at the Vietnam War later in the class. This idea of the United States as kind of world police, that we're going to, when something bad happens in the world, we feel impelled to go and set the situation right and kind of act as this kind of police role. Now, one of the things that I think we can see is anytime you start to have somebody acting as law enforcement, whether it be police at a local level or the United States in this global sense, you also have disparities in policing. I think that's a reality, and another thing we're going to probably have to look at as we work our way through. And one of the things that Americans are going to be blamed for doing, not only in Cuba and the Philippines and some of these other Latin American places, is the United States is going to be blamed for protecting their own interests over the interests of the people that actually live there. So as this comes to be, as we see the continuity of the Monroe Doctrine, right? This idea that in 1823 he's going to address Congress and he's going to say that the United States is going to treat any military intervention in Latin America by European power as a threat to American security. Roosevelt, one of our changes we might be able to see here is he's going to reaffirm the Monroe Doctrine and expand it by declaring that the United States has the right to preemptive action. What's preemptive action mean? If you preempt something, what are you doing? What's pre mean?
Before.
Okay, so let's use the context clues here. What? I mean, yeah, before anything actually, before anybody asks for your help or before we're going to maybe have an actual situation occur, one of the things that Roosevelt's going to say is, if we think something bad's going to happen, we can act on that. Now that might create, could we see where that might create issues? Could you imagine if the police in America, like just our regular police, maybe we got to take this down to the individual level, if the police thought something bad was going to happen or you were going to do something bad and they could just show up and like arrest you? You think that'd create problems?
Yeah, it should.
Probably. Even like we look at some of these other issues maybe related to stereotyping in policing, and that's not what we're here to talk about today, but the idea that like maybe we can see this on a global scale where all of a sudden you look at other people's and you start to go like, well, we think something bad's going to happen, so we're going to do something in advance. And that is actually, I'll make an argument today, that that's one of the things that's going to lead us to the Philippines and lead us to colonizing the Philippines instead of giving us their independence from Spain. So if we keep looking at this, we can see the idea that Roosevelt's policy is going to justify repeated police actions in what are going to be called dysfunctional Caribbean and Latin American countries by the United States Marines and Naval Forces. And as this happens, one of the things we're going to do is start using this doctrine to build military bases in other countries. This is something that I don't think most of us ever think about, but the United States has military bases and naval bases in particular all over the world. Does anybody have friends, relatives, boyfriends, girlfriends in the military? Cool. All right, anybody on active duty somewhere else in the world right now? Where are they at, Jaden? Somewhere in Europe. Nadia?
Japan.
Japan. Huge military presence in Japan. We have all sorts of problems there. Other places? Kuwait? Yeah, I know a couple of people that have been in Kuwait recently. And like I know one of my friends just got back from Bosnia. He was there with the Iowa Air National Guard. One of my friends is constant deployment guy. Well, actually now that Afghanistan's done, he's back and he's hoping not to get deployed. He's been deployed 11 times because he's a bomber pilot, like drops bombs on people's villages for a living, which is kind of fucked up. It's a weird person to drink with. It's all sorts of angsty. But, okay, so just sampling this room, we know that the United States, like one of the things that's gonna be a long-term continuity, or like one of the connections to today we could identify, is that as the United States starts to expand as this police power, first in the Caribbean, we're gonna use this to start putting military and naval bases in other countries. And so like, this is one of the things that we can see the United States as world police, the idea that like, one of the first places we're gonna expand outside of our borders is to the naval base at Guantanamo Bay, which is still active. The prison at Guantanamo Bay has been shut down now in the post I don't know, torturing Islamic terrorists era. But the military base is still there, and this approach is sometimes going to be called gunboat diplomacy. The idea that naval forces and Marines land in a national capital, especially to protect American and Western personnel and business interests we could put in there as well, temporarily seize control of the government and dictate policies friendly to American business, such as the repayment of foreign loans. And this is something we're going to see in Latin America many times over. Many American companies, starting in the 1800s during the Industrial Revolution, are going to invest heavily throughout Latin America, whether it be an agricultural interest for things that we can't grow here. Like, anybody a big coffee drinker? Nico, what are you doing? Was watching videos? Get the fuck out of here. I don't mean it literally yet, but next time I will. I haven't had to throw anybody all the way out all year. But, like, anybody drink coffee? Like, I'm a big coffee drinker person. Like, we don't grow coffee in the United States for the most part. It has to be grown somewhere else in places like Colombia, and the idea that, like, American companies that wanted to profit off coffee, and American companies that still want to, they need to, in some way, control that industry within other countries. And so as we see some of these things developing, lots of the things we take for granted that are foods that we can eat every single day, like, are things that you just really can't grow in the United States that need to be grown in different climates. And that's going to be one of the things that leads us into some of these other countries. Things like sugar in particular are going to increase our relationship with places like Hawaii, like we saw on Tuesday. Also, it's going to lead us to this conflict in Cuba, at least partially. And so as we see this, we're kind of, one of the other things that American business interests are going to do, like the big banks in the United States, they're going to start investing in these countries in Latin America when they get new governments. So let's say Jackson decides to overthrow the government in whatever country he's from Latin America. You take power, you've got all these plans, right? That's how you, well, aside from like having probably the biggest army, whatever, you take over control of the country. If you've got all these plans to rebuild the country, start a new, more modern society, one of the things you're going to need is a lot of investment capital to underwrite that. And American banks were happy during the late 1800s, early 1900s to repeatedly invest lots of money in Latin American countries with really high interest rates. This would be like essentially like taking out all these loans on a credit card. Maybe you guys haven't learned this lesson yet. Hopefully you will avoid it. But the idea that like people love to give people credit cards because they can charge them tons of interest. The idea that like these countries are going to take out these loans and there's no chance they're going to be able to repay them based on their actual like gross domestic product or how their economy actually functions. So one of the other things that's going to happen is if you have all of these different loans, your government becomes unstable because Jackson's program for improving whatever country is just taken over isn't working. You're about to default on all these loans. You're losing your political support. Maybe your government's going to get overthrown by Michael. Michael's going to overthrow the government. But the United States is going to show up to go like, we got to make sure we get some of this money back for these American business interests. Does that make sense? So like, for example, in 1905, Roosevelt's going to send the Marines to occupy the Dominican Republic and establish financial supervision of the Dominican government. So imperialists often frame such actions as humanitarian. They're going to celebrate themselves as practitioners of nation building and civilizing these countries while helping to uplift debtor nations in Latin America that lack many of the qualities and disciplines of self-control or just lack the resources to modernize in ways that are going to be easy. So we have on one side here this kind of Roosevelt corollary, the idea that we can send the military to protect some of these different interests in other countries. We're also going to have what's called dollar diplomacy. This is going to be another change during this time period. And this is going to be kind of a less costly method because it doesn't involve sending the military. Anytime you send the military anywhere, there's all sorts of different costs and risks associated. First, you're going to drive, like people are either going to be happy the military is being deployed somewhere or they're not. You have actual Americans going somewhere. If they start to die in large numbers, that changes how people at home view some of these situations. We're going to see that particularly in Vietnam. But if you're just investing through this kind of dollar diplomacy method, this is going to be kind of a less costly way to get involved in these other countries. And it's going to avoid the troubles of military occupation. So Washington, or like the government in Washington, D.C. is going to work with bankers to provide loans to Latin American nations in exchange for some level of control over their national fiscal affairs. Sometimes this is really small. Like, for instance, we could see the United States giving a loan to specific countries in other places, then taking kind of like giving them just kind of some advice about what they should do with those loans to build up their country. On the flip side, it could be like as involved as like in Argentina at one point in time, we're going to see an American bank essentially tell them how to rebuild their entire economy. It's going to be a huge disaster. Roosevelt's first going to implement dollar diplomacy on a vast scale, while President Taft and Wilson are going to continue the practice in various forms during their own administrations. And one of the things that we can see here is a little bit of agency. The idea that like how these leaders wanted to view America's place in the world or change the profile of the United States is going to lead them to doing dollar diplomacy in different ways. And especially as we work, like Roosevelt has a very internationalist vision for the United States. He's the person that views America as a country on the rise that might become the most powerful country in the world. And that ties in well with who Theodore Roosevelt was as a person. Teddy Roosevelt was kind of like a historical badass. His mom and his wife died on the same day one time of different things. When he was like your guys' age. And he just decided, like, he's from a rich family, so he can do whatever he wants. But like, his wife and his mother die, and he just moves out and starts a ranch out in North Dakota. And he's going to like recruit all of these former cowboys and like actual natives and like all of these kind of people to come and just hang out with him there at this giant ranch. And like, he just plays cowboy for a few years. Then he's going to go back to school. He's going to play football at Harvard, and he's going to like become like I don't know, go into government. He's going to become Secretary of the Navy, which he ultimately quits when the Spanish-American War happens because he wants to start his own volunteer regiment called the Rough Riders to go to the Spanish-American War, and like he invites all of his friends, whether they be like his college football buddies or like people he met out playing cowboys and Indians out on the plains, and like he just brings them all to Puerto Rico, and like. Then they end up in Cuba, they charge up San Juan Hill. It's a big deal. I don't know, we'll get there as we kind of get into the actual conflict today. But this is going to kind of contribute to instability in Latin America, because as these debts to European and American bankers allow for these countries to modernize in some ways, it's going to also destabilize other parts of the region. So like bankers, especially financial houses in London and New York, are going to see Latin America as an opportunity for investment. But these lenders are also going to take advantage of their kind of newly formed governments and the need these governments have for cash to enact new programs. And they're going to put huge interest rates on these massive loans, which are then going to be sold off in pieces on the secondary bond market. This creates instability for these because all of a sudden the people that initially agreed to these financial agreements aren't the people that any longer hold the loans. So like, this sounds complex, but like, let's say Kendall decides to loan me a bunch of money. You know, I'm in bad shape, Kendall. I need $4 million. You got me. You decide to diversify because you're like, that's a bad risk. I wish I wouldn't have taken it. There's no way that guy's paying me back. Understandable, right? And to mitigate your risk, maybe what you're going to do is take that $4 million and break it up into a bunch of other pieces. Maybe you're going to sell Michael some. Maybe you're going to sell Jackson some. You're going to sell both the Jaden some. Your firm of Jaden and Jaden right there. You're going to buy part of this debt. You're both named Jaden. I don't know if you get that. You sit next to each other, which threw me off for a long time. I thought I just had your name wrong. No, I was right, just spelled different. But anyway, Kevin, you get your $4 million back. Good for you. You were also the person that gave me the loan, so maybe we had like an agreement, I was gonna pay it off over time, or maybe you were gonna cut me a little bit slack, we had an existing relationship. Now you all own my debt. You're gonna come collect it, right? Because this is now your new asset. Michael, you're like, I'm trying to make money off this. You owe me a bunch of interest. We can see where that might create problems as people are breaking this down into smaller pieces, selling off to other people that are then gonna wanna collect. That's one of the problems that's gonna develop in Latin America. It's also what led us kind of in a similar way to the Great Recession in 2009, but that's a whole different story. Dollar diplomacy. We got this down, the idea that America invests in other countries, creates some of these different kind of relationships is going to allow the United States to exert more influence. We still do this today in a lot of different ways. Usually it's corporations taking on the risk now, but the idea that like, we see American business interests. If you travel globally, you're gonna see like, I don't know, one of the things, one of my advisors in graduate school, he studies the Middle East, and he was riding a camel in Saudi Arabia across a desert, and he went to this little shack that was like a convenience store. Like in the middle of the desert, they rolled up on camels so they could water these camels, that's like the purpose of it. And he could buy Coca-Cola there, and it like tripped him all the way out. Like that they thought this was just somebody's like mud hut. American companies are still really invested in other places. I guess that's my point. That's gonna start during this time period, not just our companies, but also financial interests. That's going to increase America's kind of influence and also maybe risk within these countries. So also, people are asking some other questions just like that maybe are social and cultural during this time period. The idea is, should the United States act as an empire? Or were foreign interventions and taking of territory antithetical to its founding democratic ideals? What exactly should be the relationship between the United States and its territories, and could colonial subjects be successfully and safely incorporated into the body politic as American citizens? Spanish-American and Philippine-American wars brought these questions, which had lurked behind discussions of American expansion, out into the open. And one of the things is, the United States had started to kind of look overseas for some of the reasons we talked about on Tuesdays. And on Tuesday, the idea that we wanted to go to the Philippines, particularly in order to open up a road to China, a market for American consumer goods. Cuba, we always had a little bit of a different relationship with. Cuba is going to, even today, has a really unique relationship with the United States. We can see this in Luis Perez Jr.'s book here called On Becoming Cuban. And this is really, I don't know, it's not that many pages, like 500. This is a 500-page book describing how close culturally Cuba and the United States have traditionally been. Anybody been to Cuba? No. You could, though, for a minute. There's 1 minute in time before Trump took office and started being a dick that you could go to Cuba. You know why I'm still mad about this? Because I was supposed to go to Cuba and Donald Trump fucked me over. What else is there? No, I was supposed to go to a conference, present a paper at the International Agricultural History Conference, probably about soil chemistry, Bailey. It was going to be super interesting. But then they reinstituted the embargo on going to Cuba. I was just going to go like read this paper out loud and then drink rum and smoke cigars on the beach. Like just hang out in Cuba. It sounded like a very fun time. They moved the conference to Tampa. Nobody wants to go to Tampa. Tampa's lame. Sorry, I know you're from there. I've been to Busch Gardens though. You already know I go to Tampa. Hey, it's not Cuba. Like it'd be cooler to go to Cuba. That's what I'm saying, Jake. Not to run down your hometown.
I didn't do nothing to.
That's true. I didn't mean that as a slight to you.
Not like Tampa, just like bad.
It's not bad. I've just been there many times. And it has the Yankees AAA team. That sucks.
Bucks.
Sure, Tom Brady. Anyway. Sorry, Jaden. I forgot you were from Tampa. I didn't mean to slander your hometown.
You just went into it. No warning.
I legit didn't go to that conference though, because it was in Tampa. That's an honest truth. But because I've been there a lot of times. My grandparents live in Port Charlotte, so we'd always fly into Tampa, and we'd go there. I went there many times when I was a child. Jaden's gonna be mad for the rest of the semester now, because he thinks I hate his hometown. I was just excited to go to Havana, Cuba. Is that so hard to understand, Jackson? No. Anyway, you can't go to Cuba. But Cuba, being 90 miles south of Florida, has like these ties, like cultural, social, economic ties that have been long-standing to the United States. And people in Cuba, and this is what Perez argues in this book, are, especially as they come out of the Spanish-American War era, they're going to have kind of this affinity for American culture. And American culture is going to be pervasive. Baseball's really popular in Cuba. That's one of the things he bases this argument around. But also things like American consumer goods are going to be very popular. And like in a very detailed way, he breaks down how people in Cuba after the revolution are going to spend a lot of time trying to kind of gain access to different American things. And different American cultural things are going to be very popular there. And we're going to see a long-standing relationship prior to the onset of the Fidel Castro regime, which we'll look at later in the semester. We're going to see like a lot of exchange. People in Miami in particular are going to spend a lot of time going back and forth to Cuba, especially the north part of the country is going to have all of these resorts that are really popular with Americans. You can literally get on a boat and be there in an hour. It's not a very long trip, and we're going to see this kind of relationship develop even before the Spanish-American War. During Spanish colonization of the country, one of the things that's going to happen is American investors start practicing this kind of dollar diplomacy within the country. American sugar companies in particular are going to start buying up lands and developing these large sugar plantations in Cuba, even while still under Spanish control. One of the other things is we look at the Spanish-American War as kind of being this touchstone moment where we're going to see kind of a significant change. We look at it as like a short 6-month-long war. But for the Cubans, this started much earlier. They're struggling for their independence for like decades before this. And so like Perez is going to write here, Cuba Libre cost Cubans dearly. Not all suffered equally, of course, but most suffered some and many suffered much. These were decades of recurring cycles of Cuban rebellion and Spanish repression. First, the 10 Years' War from 1868 to 78, then the Little War from 1879 to 80, and finally the War of Independence from 1895 to 98. In all, 30 years of intermittent revolution and repression, random depredation alternating with systemic devastation, successive acts of reprisal and revenge, of pillage and plunder, of homes destroyed and lives disrupted. And we can see this maybe through like individual people. So like one of the most famous people that's commonly associated with this conflict is this guy named, oh, they took the trash can out. Jose Marti. And Jose Marti is going to be kind of an interesting person in that he's going to be born into Cuba to a relatively wealthy family in the colonial system to the point of he's going to be sent to Spain to complete his education. He goes to a Spanish university. And as Jose Marti kind of goes to Spain and he gets to college, he decides he wants to do something about some of the injustices that are happening in his country. And he's going to actually study like the Spanish system of abuses in Cuban prisons. And when he finishes his education, he goes back, he's going to try to be a revolutionary. Eventually he becomes a fugitive because he's trying to essentially overthrow the Spanish government in Cuba. And he ends up becoming kind of an exile in New York City. And while he's in New York, Jose Marti is going to gain a platform. People in the United States are interested in Cuba for a variety of reasons, whether they be those economic reasons. We have large sugar plantations there, the possibility of future economic expansion in Cuba, or the idea that maybe we should just help these people gain their independence in the same way the United States gained its independence from Britain. And Jose Marti is going to get a platform in New York. He's going to start writing in newspapers, both in Spanish and English, advocating for a Cuba run by Cubans. And he's going to actually continue to ask Americans to support the revolutionary effort in Cuba, but he doesn't want America to get directly involved. He wants Americans to put pressure on the Spanish in other ways, be they economic or social cultural pressure, but he doesn't want the American military to go to Cuba because Jose Marti is very worried that if the American military goes to Cuba, America is going to gain some kind of dominance over the country that might ultimately lead to Cuba becoming an American territory or state, which, I mean, he wasn't crazy because, like, Puerto Rico kind of is that. Like, Puerto Rico eventually becomes an American territory, which it still is today. We're aware of that, right? Like, Puerto Ricans are also Americans. That's an important thing to keep in mind. And like, so Winnebago, they're having labor shortage issues, like everyone in the country, and they started to have labor shortage issues a few years ago, and they started importing people from Puerto Rico to work at the factory, which actually makes sense. After there's a giant hurricane in Puerto Rico, those people were displaced, the country was struggling, and they had these people move to Forest City, and this created all sorts of problems. Because like, oh my God, I was standing one time, looking out a window. I won't say where because it'd give away who I was talking to maybe. And this person turns to me and goes, all of these goddamn illegal Mexicans moving to Forest City. And I was like, but those people are Puerto Ricans. And they're like, all these goddamn illegal Puerto Ricans moving to Forest City. I was like, you know Puerto Rico's part of the United States, right? And they're like, no, it's not. I was like, fuck, look at a map, dude. These are the people that are always right about everything, you know? Like, these are the smartest people on the internet that are the loudest. You're like, you're a fucking moron. They're taking our jobs. And you're like, nobody wants to work at Winnebago. That's why they're constantly hiring for $18 an hour. Anyway. Jose Marti's worried about Cuba. Because he wants his country to fight their own war. I assume that's about what you can get, yeah. Jane's about to just give it all up. Waldorf wrestling career is over. He's just going to be working on the line at Winnebago. That's always an option. Maybe that's where our man Ford went. Just working the line at Winnebago. Yes?
So what's so wrong if Cuba is territory or state that lies in Cuba?
Well, so Jose Marti, one of the things that he was arguing for in the same way that, like, we see a lot of these peoples, I think as Americans, sometimes we have this vision that, like, this is what you would want to be. But also, one of the things during this time period is what Jose Marti and other Cubans are advocating for is they want a Cuba that's ruled by Cubans. That they want their own independence, to make their own decisions, to have their own agency over what happens to them in their country. And because, like, they are going to gain independence, one of the things that comes out of Jose Marti arguing for this is as the United States goes to the Philippines and Cuba, and Cuba eventually comes out from under Spanish territorial rule, Cuba's going to be given its actual independence. This is an important thing for us to consider today. And because of Jose Marti, one of the things that's going to happen is we're going to pass the Teller Amendment before we go there. And the Teller Amendment is going to be a political piece of legislation that's a change that says the United States, basically what it says is, the United States will not colonize Cuba. We're going to go help them win their independence if we go there. We're going to overthrow the Spanish rule, and we will then give them their independence free from American governmental interference. Now, our companies and banks are going to become very involved in Cuba, and they're going to have influence to such an extent that when Fidel Castro takes over the country of Cuba during the 1950s and leads it to being the communist country it still is today, we're going to see Fidel Castro base most of his arguments on the Americans have way too much influence in Cuba, and like we really didn't get our independence from them when the revolution happened. So, we'll get some of the details here. In 1898, Americans began in earnest to turn their attention towards the problems plaguing Cuba. Since the middle of the 19th century, Cubans had been fighting for their own independence from Spain. So one of the things here, we can see a continuity. Cubans are pushing against this colonial Spanish power for quite some time prior to 1898 when the United States is going to get involved. The change is the United States is going to get involved. This idea that The latest uprising, the one that would prove fatal to Spain's colonial designs, began in 1895 and was still raging in the winter of 1898 when the United States government in particular starts to focus on this conflict. And so in an attempt to crush the uprising, the Spanish general is going to be conducting a reconcentration policy. This is going to be one of the things that the United States looks at really unfavorably. What the Spanish are doing essentially is moving what they view as problem communities to camps. Now, at the time period, they would have called them concentration camps, but like after World War II, I don't want to confuse you. Like the idea, like they're not moving these people to exterminate them like the Germans were doing with Jewish people during World War II. They're moving them to just take populations that are causing them problems throughout Cuba to new locations. To kind of try to undercut this revolutionary kind of aspect within society. And so they're forcing Cubans living in specific cities to relocate en masse to military camps for a time period of about 2 years. Prominent newspaper publishers are going to start to sensationalize Spanish atrocities. And again, here we see Jose Marti coming into the mix as an agent. He's writing in American newspapers about some of the terrible things that he's hearing from other people in Cuba that the Spanish government's doing. And as he does this, it's starting to drive support of this. And I think we can understand this because we see things gain all sorts of weird momentum on the internet today, right? The idea that like, I don't know. How does anyone get canceled? How does we see people get like, do you have anybody that like is a real social justice warrior that shows up on your timelines? Like you got somebody in mind that just like, no matter what happens in the world, they're gonna be really mad about it? Yes, no, maybe it's just old people. I feel like there's 100 people I know that just like, whatever's this week's thing to be mad about on the internet, that's what they're mad about. That's how they live their whole life. So maybe we can understand how like media influences kind of some of these causes to get involved. So like as Jose Marti writes for some of these newspapers, we see other people picking up these stories. We're going to see this sensationalized. We're going to see this kind of sensationalized Spanish atrocity trope develop. Cubans in the United States and their allies raised cries of Cuba Libre, and while the U.S. government proclaimed a wish to avoid armed conflict with Spain, President McKinley is going to be concerned about the safety of American lives and property in Cuba. This is a really important change. So one of the things that's happening is we've seen the development of America's ability to send the military to these different places if they're threatening American interest, whether that be Americans, people living in these other countries in Latin America, or if we have huge American business interests, which there are huge American sugar plantations in Cuba at the time of the revolution, that we can go protect those interests. So McKinley is going to become concerned. Part of this is going to be what we call yellow journalism. We're going to see a contest between two New York newspapers. If you've ever heard about this conflict before, you were talking about Hearst and Pulitzer and their contest to get different readers, basically like, again, a parallel today, the idea that like newspapers write sensationalized headlines to get more clicks, right? They don't have any information, you have to click on it to understand what's happening in the story. Maybe this is an 1890s version of clickbait, like the idea of these newspapers are trying to compete with each other, so they're writing stories that aren't necessarily all the way true, and they have all these sensationalized details that then make people more interested in their stories. And that's going to contribute to this groundswell of support for some kind of military interaction. And McKinley's going to send the Cuba, the battleship Maine to Havana Harbor in January 1898. What's going to happen to the USS Maine?
Oh, it's gonna blow up, but we think it's them, but it's not actually, it's just the boilers.
Ooh, Maddie's got a full breakdown. This is good. What? Is there a back? You did both sides?
Yeah.
I don't know where the papers went. Oh, here we go. It's already wrinkled for you, but
It's gonna get folded up anyway.
no, you gotta turn it in at the end, maybe. So, as Nadia told us, the USS Maine's gonna go to Havana Harbor and it's gonna explode. We've heard this. Remember the Maine. You guys had to have gone to like K through 12 education to arrive here. So like as this is happening, one of the things that's going to develop. Nadia mentions that like the boiler exploded, which is a possibility. There's a couple of different theories on what happened to the Maine. At the time period, right when it happens, they start reporting in the newspapers that Cuban revolutionaries have angered some of these Spanish interests. The idea that the United States has sent this boat there and is establishing a military presence in Cuba means they're going to support the Cubans and overthrow the Spanish government. And as they do this, when the Maine explodes, people are going to be really upset and they're going to say that the Spanish blew up the boat. In reality, probably one of two things happened. Either there was a boiler explosion. You guys know how boilers work?
Yeah, there's steam in the boat, right?
It could overheat. Okay, so let's think about it. This is why it's great. We have a board. We're going to draw our USS Maine, right? This will be a very scientific drawing, right? We have the bridge, we need a big stack. And this stack, you know, like we always think about boats, like putting off some of the things. This is now we're gonna make this 3D, right? We're going down to the bottom. Where's the smoke coming from? It's coming from a giant furnace. You need a furnace if you're gonna have a boiler, because what you do to make a mechanical process work with a boiler is you create steam, which then generates power. So like, and then you can use that to, so like, let's say we have this here, we have our little furnace room. We're gonna have a furnace room. Chalk wouldn't do this to me, Blake. This is how life is though, you know, the grass is always greener. Whatever, we got a little guy down here. He's got a shovel.
Wants to chop his head off with his shovel.
No, he was still growing ahead. But basically what you're gonna do is you're gonna use this heat, you're gonna funnel the heat into a tank with water in it. The water is going to be heated. That's gonna create steam. During that process, all of a sudden you're creating this momentum. They would use a flywheel, and then they would use that to turn a turbine that's going to ultimately like move the boat. That's a very simplistic way of looking at this. But what's going to happen here is poor ship construction. I talked to you the other day about how the United States was building new types of ships. We had moved from kind of wooden, masted sailing ships like you would think about being really old-timey, to we're moving to more modern ships like we're used to seeing today, like if you ever played the game Battleship, you know, like steel-sided American naval vessels. And so one of the mistakes they made was designing these ships poorly. And the Maine was one of the first four kind of really modern ships that was being built during the 1890s. And so it has this steam technology to make it work. And you got this guy down here shoveling coal into this big blast furnace. But one of the problems they had was they stored all the ammunition right next to this giant fire that they're using to heat and this water to drive this steam boiler process. And either you could have two different types of explosions here. One probably happened after the other. Either they overheated the boiler by not checking the pressure gauge, because as you create steam, it's going to build pressure. This is why, so I have a steam engineer's license, right? I can drive big steam tractors. You can do this out at Heritage Park. They have steam school in the spring. If you want to go, I'll hook you up. It's super weird. You can hang out with old guys in suspenders and overalls all day and learn how to drive 20,000-pound steam tractors. Not very popular though, and steam tractors even today are really dangerous, because as you kind of do this, when you build this fire, what happens is the pressure goes up and up, and that's what actually creates the energy necessary to drive the machine. And so like, if you don't pay attention to your pressure gauge, it will just overheat and overexpand, and then eventually you could just like blow the whole thing sky high. This is actually, this happened at a parade. Somebody was driving a steam thresher in Indiana a few years ago, and basically turned this giant 20,000-pound steam tractor into a fragmentation grenade in the middle of this 4th of July parade. It killed a bunch of people. This also has happened like during this time period. This is a thing that happened quite often. This is where like, some of you have heard of the Great Four-City Hotel War. Maybe not, the Waldorf and the Summit. This is how we got our university. They told you about it on your tour if you ever visited here. City Hall in Forest City, you guys know where that is, down by the post office? Used to be a 3-story building that also went like, it took up most of that whole block. And at one point in time, they mismanaged their boiler and it blew up half the building, and that's why City Hall's only 1 story of the remnant of that building. But on the USS Maine, so either their boiler exploded, and that also paired with like all of this ammunition and gunpowder being stored on board to explode, or they were careless with this fire that was being put in here, and then that exploded the ammunition hold. They didn't really do like the CSI forensic investigation at the time. But as Nadia pointed out initially, something went wrong. The ship blew up. It probably wasn't Spanish people, but the United States used this as a pretense to go to war with the Spanish in Cuba. And as this happens, we see kind of public support really swell. We talked about Teddy Roosevelt a little bit earlier, and the idea that Teddy Roosevelt puts together this group of Rough Riders and aside giving like DMX the name for his eventual rap clique in the 90s. We do see the Rough Riders fight at the Battle of San Juan Hill. And Teddy Roosevelt was like really big on public image. He was getting ready to run for president of the United States. And one of the things that he did was like he took a pistol that had been on the USS Maine when it exploded, and he brought it and shot somebody with it during the Spanish-American War while he's charging up San Juan Hill, which I always thought was kind of like a badass thing to do. And like he told people all about it and ran in every newspaper in the country. The actual military conflict, once the United States gets involved, is very, very short. It lasts about 3 months from the time the USS Maine explodes to when the Spanish agree to give up control of Cuba, and the United States is largely going to be successful militarily here. And as this happens, people are going to really have to start to think about this idea of American expansion. Also as a part of this, we're going to attack the Philippines the same time we go to Cuba. Anybody know anything about the Philippines? Spanish Asians. Why do you say that?
I just hear that a lot.
I always think about it as like Asian or Pacific Islander people with Spanish and American names.
Yeah, I just hear it a lot.
Like my friend Andrew Lopez, he's a comedian, and when he first started his career, when he was still telling like really shitty jokes and wasn't famous yet, he would like tell this joke about how like he has an English first name and a Spanish last name because he's from the Philippines. But the idea that they were under Spanish colonial rule for a long time, and as the United States decides to go to war with Spain over these colonial holdings, we're going to send a fleet of ships from Hong Kong into the Philippines, and we're going to militarily occupy the country while the war in Cuba is going on as well. And as we come to the conclusion of that conflict, we're going to see this kind of become part of the peace agreement. The United States is going to gain control of the Philippines. And so one of the other things we talked about earlier is this idea that Jose Marti had a voice as a historical agent of these New York papers, and he wanted a Cuba ruled by Cubans. And as this happened, he's going to be successful because we passed the Teller Amendment that says, no matter what, we're not going to colonize Cuba. There's no such thing that gets put in place in the Philippines, and the United States is going to decide to try to colonize the Philippines. So we can see this in the text. In the author, like the Cubans, Filipinos had waged a long war against their Spanish colonizers. The United States could have given them the independence they had long fought for, but instead, at the behest of William McKinley, the United States occupied the islands from 1899 to 1902 and waged a bloody series of conflicts against Filipino insurrectionists that cost far more lives than the war with Spain. This is wild warfare that happens in the Philippines. Emilio Aguinaldo is going to be the leader of these Filipino forces fighting against the United States. We know a lot about this because of kind of a variety of different things. So, like here we can see Stanley Karnow. Stanley Karnow is a winner of the Pulitzer Prize. He wrote a book about Vietnam that's really important. That he covered the Vietnam War as a newspaper reporter, and then wrote some like very, I don't know, serious, large books about other countries. And he wrote this one. He says, the imperialists prevailed in 1898. The United States went to war with Spain, the first war waged by America beyond its continental boundaries. An inexorable force drove the nation into war, but like all wars, it was not inevitable. It began over Cuba, where the rebels were struggling against Spanish tyranny. Skilled Cuban propagandists in the United States, abetted by Hearst and other sensationalists, including Pulitzer, had won America's sympathy. American investors in Cuba favored an end to Spanish rule. For the Spanish, whose Latin American empire had crumbled, Cuba was the last vestige of past grandeur, and its potential loss had already ignited political passion in Spain. Congress had affirmed at the outset that America intended to be free, intended to free, not acquire Cuba. But America's ultimate goal for the Philippines, a slideshow to the main Cuban arena, was left undefined. There, on secret orders from Roosevelt, the U.S. fleet commanded by Commodore George Dewey had sunk a decrepit Spanish armada in Manila Bay. There were 8 wooden Spanish sailing ships in the Manila harbor when the United States fleet arrives from Hong Kong. And we have 4 modern ships that are in Hong Kong that go, and they just destroy these 8 old wooden Spanish ships that are in the Philippines. That's going to be the basis of our military victory there. He's going to complain with Dewey's first request for forces to secure his victory, and another historical first, U.S. troops are going to cross the Pacific. They occupy Manila shortly afterward under an arrangement with the Spanish, while McKinley continued to contemplate the future of the Philippines. Eventually, he decides that the United States is going to turn them into a colony. And one of the things that McKinley's going to talk about repeatedly is that he doesn't believe the Filipinos are fit to rule themselves. So we have a cultural dynamic here, particularly like an ethnocentric racial construct is going to be really important to the United States deciding to colonize the Philippines. Where we looked at the Cubans as being a more advanced people close to the United States, with European ancestry, in particular, the native peoples on Cuba or Hispaniola were completely wiped out. And this idea that we're going to see the United States look favorably on the Cuban people from an ethnic standpoint. On the other side, we're going to see the United States talk about repeatedly the idea that the Filipinos aren't fit to rule themselves. And eventually they might be, but they're not. And so the Philippine insurrection, the Philippine-American War is going to be this brutal conflict of occupation insurgency. This is where the United States military for the first time is also going to practice total war, where we're not going to differentiate between civilians and active military people on the other side. So one of the things that happens is we're going to start kind of going from village to village. There's going to be all sorts of atrocities perpetrated by the American military in the Philippines over the 3 years this is happening. Like, we're talking about like burning villages to the ground and killing all the people that live there. Like, there's all sorts of, if you went on to Google image search, you could go in and find lots of pictures of Filipino bodies just stacked up in different places. One of the things that made this really difficult and made the Philippines a difficult place to conquer is that they didn't view themselves, and still largely today, they are a country, but they have like so many different identities making up their country. They are a people that during kind of the pre-Spanish colonization time period didn't have any kind of national structure. It was largely tribalist, and there were like small individual village level groups of people. And so like one of the things about the Philippines today even is that like they have more languages spoken there than anywhere else in the world. There's all sorts of like tiny things. It's also why if you meet Filipino people, they are like, you can meet people from different parts of the Philippines, and they like don't look alike, they don't sound alike, they don't have the same heritage, even though they're from the same country. I think that's an important part that fed into this as well. So one of the reasons why the United States shifts to this kind of total war mentality is that they're fighting kind of guerrilla warfare. This idea that they're going to be attacking the United States where they have the opportunities. And so like one of the things that's going to happen is many comment on the brutality and the uncertain mission of American troops. In April 1899, dispatch from Harper's Weekly correspondent who's in the Philippines begins to quote, "A week has passed, a week of fighting and marching, of jungles and rivers, of incident and adventures so varied and of so rapid transition that to sit down and write about it makes one feel as if you were trying to describe a dream where time, space, and all other logical sequences of ordinary life are upset in the unrelenting brutality of war." John Bass described the experiences in detail, and his reporting combined with accounts that came directly from soldiers helped shape public knowledge about the war. And the things that people were reporting back were about these incredible atrocities and attacking villages and completely destroying entire populations. Yes?
I'm not sure if I caught this, but like, why did we go to war with the Philippines? Like, what did they do? So
this is a point of conflict too. So we go to, when we decide we're gonna go to war with Spain. We go to war not only in Cuba, but we also go in the Philippines because they're another Spanish colony.
Oh.
And we have an American military presence that's already in Hong Kong, in China. And so like, this is one of the things, McKinley doesn't authorize the military force against the Spanish holdings in the Philippines. He, like the Congress and the act of war is specifically geared towards Cuba, but it doesn't necessarily say that. So Theodore Roosevelt, who's Secretary of the Navy, he's going to dispatch this part of the American fleet that's in Asia already to go attack the Spanish in the Philippines. And this is where like people really question this historically. They ask what our motivations were for going there, and this is where like Zach was talking about the other day, he's not here today, but the idea that maybe we went to the Philippines for this economic benefit. A lot of Americans are talking during this time period about opening up markets in Asia to American consumer goods to help kind of create new markets for American business. And as this happens, this is going to be one of the things that maybe leads us to war in the Philippines and trying to colonize. And so as this really kind of unfolds, we're going to see kind of America deciding to move outside of its borders for the first time. So Roosevelt's going to insist on kind of this big stick and this persuasive power of the United States military, and that this can ensure American hegemony over strategically important regions in the Western Hemisphere, and I would even argue beyond. We're going to start trying to hold pieces of land globally that help promote American interests. This is where, like, when we get to World War II, although one of you might do a project on, like, the Battle of Midway. There's a movie that came out about it recently, and we're going to, at some point, draft out these World War II kind of topics you guys are going to do for your own projects. But, like, we hold the island of Midway because it's a good refueling point in the Pacific Ocean. We hold the islands in Guam because they're a good place for our naval boats even today to stop, refuel, and lay over. We have the Hawaiian Islands, like we saw on Tuesday, as a strategically important defense for the western coast of the United States. And this is going to be one of the legacies, and one of the reasons why this is historically significant is that as we see these policies expanding, they're going to allow the United States to protect American interests globally, or to go for, like in Cuba, the idea that we're helping bring them democracy and self-rule. These are things that are going to be important for us to understand. We'll understand a lot better context as we move through kind of the next 100 years of history. Because the same things that we're talking about in the Philippines and in Cuba are some of the conversations that are going to surround like the Vietnam War or the Korean War, or some of these other things as they kind of come through. This is all a large scattered mess, Nico, but we made it. I don't know, not it.
Quick question, did we do total war, like guerrilla warfare in Cuba as well, or was it just the Philippines?
Just the Philippines. Cuba, we really had like such a huge military advantage, and the Spanish were a more traditional military power that they had like established bases, and we were able to just kind of like go attack specific locations as an aggressive party. Where in the Philippines, we took over the cities almost immediately, and then like had a really hard time holding any other territory, because it'd be similar to like the war in Afghanistan. And I don't know if you guys know anything about the war in Afghanistan. We never had a problem like holding the capital city of Kabul. We had a problem subduing people throughout the countryside that would continually attack American convoys, or like would plant roadside bombs or do some of these other things. And that's more what we start to see in the Philippines, and we're really going to see this in better context in Vietnam when we get there.
Because it's like jungle and stuff like that, so it's like hard, it's not just.
Well, and they don't have like the people fighting. So like once the Spanish fail in the Philippines or in Cuba, the Cuban people, because we're going to give them independence, supported the American effort in Cuba, right? So we're fighting against the Spanish, their traditional power. In the Philippines, we get rid of the Spanish, but we also don't want to give the Filipinos power over their own country.
Because we wanted it for economic reasons.
Sure, and we also like had racial and ethnic reasons for not wanting. We said like they weren't ready to rule themselves. That was a big argument the United States made. And so like where instead of like in Cuba, the people who had been fighting against the Spanish then